Hi, this is Steve Worona, and you're listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Before I introduce today's speaker, here's a brief orientation to the Adobe Connect interface we're using. Your browser right now is showing the title slide for today's talk. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a box labeled Questions and Comments where you can read and type messages. There's a tab labeled Everyone at the bottom of this box, and that's the tab you use for all of your general messages, including questions and comments for our speaker. We'll be breaking for questions several times during the presentation, so please do not hold your questions to the end. You can also send a direct message to a specific person by hovering your cursor over a name in the attendee list. And one of those names is Technical Help, and that's the place to go if you run into technical problems. We're also monitoring Twitter for your questions and comments. Use hashtag NCCPSwebinar. If you miss part of today's conversation, or if you want to see some or all of it again, this webinar is being recorded. The link will be available shortly after the webinar on the NCCPS Webinars page, and watch your email for a link to a brief evaluation survey requesting your reactions and comments on today's presentation. Please take a minute to respond to that survey when the link arrives. We do appreciate your feedback. And now for today's presentation. Today we feature our second webinar for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and our topic is Courageous Conversations and Bystander Intervention. It's uncomfortable to talk about sex, it's difficult to talk about sexual assault, and it's troubling to have to consider the behaviors of perpetrators who commit these crimes. It takes courage to have a conversation. And yet courageous community conversations about these topics are absolutely necessary. To explain why these conversations are so important and how they'll make a difference, we're welcoming today Thomas R. Tremblay, retired Chief of Police for Burlington, Vermont, and former Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Public Safety. Throughout his distinguished 30-year policing career as an officer, detective, supervisor, police chief, and state public safety commissioner, Tom Tremblay has been a passionate leader for the prevention of domestic and sexual violence. He's now a national and international advisor and trainer for police, prosecutors, advocates, higher education, the military, and the private sector. He serves as a faculty member for the International Association of Chiefs of Police National Law Enforcement Leadership Initiative on Violence Against Women Crimes. He's also on the faculty of the National Center for Campus Public Safety Trauma-Informed Sexual Assault Training Program and a senior associate for Margolis Healy, a national campus public safety firm. Tom holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and is a graduate of the 183rd session of the FBI National Academy, the FBI Law Enforcement Executive Development Seminar, the Police Executive Research Forum Senior Management Institute for Police, and the National Law Enforcement Leadership Institute on Violence Against Women. Tom Tremblay, welcome back to Campus Public Safety Online.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, and I'd like to thank the National Center for Campus Public Safety for promoting some important conversations, especially during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and pleased to be a part of this. As Steve said in the intro, talking about sex, talking about sexual assault, sexual violence, this is really complicated. It's a complex topic. It really causes trauma, it causes emotion, defensiveness. As human beings, we all have bias, and so this is a really complicated conversation. And one of the keys to this issue is that this has been a complex topic for a long, long time. The criminal justice system has struggled with response and investigations of these crimes for a long time. Higher education, the military, again, always looking for ways that we can do a better job, raise the bar. And so one of those things that's been identified by a number of research projects and subject matter experts is the need to have community conversations on this issue, even though they're complex issues to talk about. All you have to do is go to a social event sometime, a cocktail party or some sort of social event, and someone asks what I do, and if I end up saying that I work on issues around sexual assault, that social event is no longer a real fun social event. As I said, these are difficult conversations. And so what I hope to be able to do in the course of this hour is really talk about some of the 4 key courageous conversations that I've been engaging in around the country with with higher education, with law enforcement, and just share with you some of those courageous conversations, and again, try to get us to think open-mindedly about this, and again, how we can promote courageous conversations around these issues. So what we know is we are where we are today because of the activism and outrage that victims and survivors have shared. That these are part of the courageous conversations. They have shared with us that their experience in our systems has not been helpful to them, has not been helpful to the recovery, and the real concern for all of us is making sure that we can support someone in the reporting process while also being fair and balanced in our approach. So the activism and outrage has been part of the courageous conversation, and that has come from victims and survivors, and it's quite frankly led us to the very first and very broad courageous conversation, number one, and that is the conversation that the federal government asks all of the universities, all of the institutions of higher education. What is the university doing to eliminate sexual harassment, sexual assault, prevent its reoccurrence, and address its effects? And so, again, very broadly, this is a huge topic. What we have seen over the course of the past several years, and I've again had the great fortune of traveling all over the country and spending time with folks who are doing this important work and hearing the challenges that they face. The reality is that in the past 4 or 5 years, institutions of higher education have come a long way. The criminal justice system has come a long way. And in my 30 years, I've never seen us progressing the way that we are right now. So this is part of that courageous conversation, is really looking at and trying to understand what's happening. What's happening on our campuses across the country, on your individual campuses. And this is the report on the Association of American Universities Campus Survey on Sexual Assault and Sexual Misconduct. I'm sure many of you have seen this. But essentially, 27 universities across the country participated in this survey. 150,000 students participated across the 27 universities and institutions. And so if your institution was one of these campuses, you're certainly very familiar with this report. That being said, it's also a great report to look at and try to understand the issues that we're all facing as part of these courageous conversations. And I guess in short, this isn't surprising to me. The results of this report, generally speaking, the average rates of non-consensual sexual contact by physical force or incapacitation across all 27 institutions are as high or slightly higher than those revealed in prior surveys and research. So no surprise to me, but it's the right step in this courageous conversation to try to understand what's happening across the country and on our individual campus. When we look at one of the graphs from this particular report, this is the percent reporting sexual contact involving physical force or incapacitation since enrolling in college. And again, what we see is the incidence of sexual assault and misconduct due to that physical force, threats of physical force, or incapacitation among female undergraduate students that responded was 23.1%, and including 10.8% who experienced penetration. The other thing that we see in this particular graph and that came out of this report that I think is important for the conversation is that the rates of sexual assault and misconduct are highest among undergraduate females and those identifying as transgender, genderqueer, non-conforming, questioning, and something that's not listed on the survey. So really this brings us to, again, one of those important conversations, which is this one kind of really creates a lot of concern. But historically, when we look at the research, when you look at who's imprisoned in our country for rape and sexual assault, what we see in the history is that most sexual violence is committed by men directed at women. And that's not to say that men can't be victims or women can't be offenders, but historically, most sexual violence is committed by men directed at women, and this becomes part of the difficulty of this conversation. What we have to understand in looking at certainly this particular survey and other survey and research that's coming forward is that all of our institutions, we have to think about equity and inclusion. Our response must be culturally relevant. We've got to think about our diverse communities and the underserved or marginalized populations that we all serve, again, in your institution. And that while historically most sexual violence is committed by men directed at women, this is an important part of it, we have to make sure that we're talking to our entire community, that we're addressing our entire community when we're looking at the prevalence of sexual assault in our country. Again, especially when you look at the LGBTQ victimization, what we see is that this is the most underreported of all crime that there is in our society. But certainly there is some evidence which suggests that the LGBTQ community, those rates of underreporting are even higher. So there's a real need for us to engage in a courageous conversation around their experiences and work in partnership with those that identify and address their concerns and safety across the campus. Again, when we look at the prevalence of this problem, this has to be part of that conversation. I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen, and I would just say this year, Harvard President Faust's statement on September 21st, 2015 in response to Harvard's involvement in the survey. What I like about this, and one of the changes that I've seen over the past year, is we seem to have moved from a debate about whether or not this is a problem. And to me, that's been part of our problem, is that we're debating this as whether or not, is it a problem? Is it 1 in 4? Is it 1 in 5? What is the problem? And certainly part of dealing with something is understanding the problem. But I think one of the changes that I've seen is this, in that we're recognizing this, we're identifying it, and what I like about this leadership message, this is a courageous conversation from my perspective, that President Faust talks about that this is our problem. It's an intolerable problem, and it's our problem. So this is a leader, an institutional leader, which is saying this is our problem. They own the problem. And I think that courageous conversations like this are going to help us, again, continue to make strides. I also had the opportunity to spend some time up in Fairbanks, Alaska in November, and yes, it is cold up there. And this is another courageous leader in a university owning the problem, apologizing for failures, and admitting that the school had not handled sexual assault cases well. I just think that this is going to help these institutions really address these issues and again, make real progress in what we're trying to accomplish. I think one of the other interesting parts of this courageous conversation that I hear about all the time, the conversation about whether or not the Title IX or the administrative system is better than the criminal justice system, or is the criminal justice system better than the Title IX system. And it's almost this national conversation, which is almost like a heavyweight title bout. And we really got to put that conversation aside and ask ourselves, are we working together? What we do know is that institutions of higher education, campus police, local police, when everyone is working together in a community coordinated way, we're going to get better results. One of the guiding documents that's come out is, of course, the White House Task Force Model MOU to help, again, institutions of higher education, campus law enforcement, local law enforcement, prosecutors communicate, talk together about avoiding these conflicts and recognizing that when the two systems work together, there's a lot of power in that. And so this memorandum of understanding helps guide all the partners through a conversation which is going to strengthen a community-coordinated response. We know it works in these cases. When we look at sexual assault investigations and you look at a blueprint across the country, whether we're in a criminal justice system or we're in a Title IX and administrative system, we know that a multidisciplinary team response that's community-coordinated, and that community coordination is based on training and policy together. Training and policy that's trauma-informed. Taking a look at the work that you're doing, internal audits, data collection and analysis, looking at your data, looking at and analyzing your data to understand the problems that are on your campus, and then again having those courageous conversations about what your findings are. Another best practice for investigations is after-action case reviews. is really taking a step back after you've completed a case, pulling the multidisciplinary team back together and reviewing the case, saying, what did we do that really worked well? What did we do that we need to improve upon? Did we follow our policy? Is policy and practice the same thing in this particular case? And there can be a lot of learning that occurs for the multidisciplinary team following a case and conducting an after-action case review. A lot of recent conversation about the value of external review or external review teams. Now, this is something that if you followed certainly what's happened in Missoula, Montana, I believe that this is one of the most compelling components of the efforts that occurred in Missoula, Montana following their Department of Justice and Department of Education investigation. Essentially, they brought in multidisciplinary partners to review every sexual assault case, whether it occurred on campus or whether it occurred in the community, and got trained external review members, advocates in the community, to review every sexual assault case to make sure that, one, it was trauma-informed, two, it was in line with their policy, and three, that it was a community-coordinated response. So whether you bring in a subject matter expert to take an outside look at your cases every once in a while, what I've heard from investigators who do this important work is that sometimes that external review and a conversation with the investigators is really kind of the next step in the way we're training investigators on this. So external review teams have a lot of promise. And then finally, again, best practices around investigations is recognizing and supporting employees who do this difficult work. They need institutional support, and they need to be thinking about self-care. If we can't care for ourselves, it's really difficult to care for others. So these are just a few of the best practices around that first courageous conversation. What is the university doing? What can we do to better respond and investigate these cases? This would be a good time, Steve, to take questions if anyone does have questions. So we'll pause for a moment or two to see if we have questions.
Thanks, Tom. And if you've just joined us, you're listening to Campus Public Safety Online. Today's speaker is Tom Tremblay, and his topic is sexual assault, courageous conversations, and bystander intervention. If you have comments or questions during the course of today's webinar, type them into that line in the questions and comments pod on the left side of your screen. We have a couple of pauses planned for questions during the webinar. Define trauma-informed, Tom.
Sure. Well, first of all, trauma-informed is a recommendation that came out of the White House Task Force to make sure that universities, colleges that are responding to sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual misconduct, stalking, dating violence, that they be trauma-informed. That essentially means that as investigators, as first responders to these incidents, as anybody who deals with the victims or complainants that are reporting, that they be trauma-informed, meaning that they understand the neurobiology of trauma. They understand what happens to the brain and the body when someone experiences trauma, such as what can occur during sexual assault or dating violence. That they understand the impacts that trauma has on the victims, and that they recognize those impacts and those behaviors as linked to trauma, as opposed to what oftentimes has happened in the past is that we've misinterpreted the behaviors of victims and we haven't connected them to trauma. So being trauma-informed means really recognizing trauma for what it is and then designing new approaches based on that science and that information.
Thanks. Tom, when you mentioned the AAU Campus Climate Survey, Connie Graham typed in, does anybody know of similar research done on Canadian schools?
I do not.
Okay, well that's a quick answer. And one more question I'll squeeze in during this break. Anne Frankie, who coincidentally is our next webinar speaker, but you'll hear about that later, asks, do some institutions conduct after-action case reviews with an attorney-client privilege?
Excellent question, Anne, and hello, by the way. Absolutely. I think after-action case reviews and even external review, when done with counsel, can maintain attorney-client privilege, as I understand it. But that's certainly something that you should check with your your legal counsel. But that's my understanding, and something that I recommend as part of after-action case reviews and external review. Again, it really allows you to take an inside look at how you responded, so that you can all learn from, again, the good work that's been done, or where you can work to raise the bar and do a better job.
Thanks, Tom. Keep those questions coming out there, and we'll be pausing again in a while. But in the meantime, Tom, I'll let you get back to your presentation.
Very good. The second courageous conversation is around alcohol and alcohol's role in sexual assault. Asking specifically, are we looking at alcohol objectively? We could take any one of the four courageous conversations that I'm going to be talking about and do a webinar on each one of these. I'm going to try to hit on some of the high points, which really focus on asking ourselves, are we looking at alcohol objectively in these cases? And I always start out by saying alcohol doesn't cause sexual assault. Choices and decisions do. But that doesn't mean, and certainly we understand, that alcohol is significantly tangled in these issues. And I think one of the things that we have to look at around this courageous conversation is we just look at some of the culture around alcohol. And this is an advertisement. I don't know how many of you saw this, but right in the middle of the holiday shopping season last December, Bloomingdale's comes out with an ad which basically says, spike your best friend's eggnog when they're not looking. And, there was a lot of outrage around this advertisement, but I remember seeing this, and it ruined my whole shopping day when I saw this, like many others. Because nothing like Christmas or the holidays says, spiking your drink is, it's so absurd to think that we look at alcohol this way, that we look at alcohol and we think that it's funny, we think that rape is funny, and this ad is somehow going to encourage shoppers to spend more. And so when we look at alcohol, we look at alcohol's role in sexual assault, and you see messages like this. These messages can be really confusing. They can be confusing to society as a whole. It promotes rape culture. It promotes alcohol, being used or drugs being used to incapacitate someone. And the insinuation here is that a man is going to do that to a woman. So this is part of the complexity of this issue. And when I turn back to the AAU survey, the risk factor results, one of the interesting things that was said, it's actually in the very overview of the report, they identify a few key risk factors, two of which are the use of alcohol and drugs, which is why we're talking about it. But the second risk factor is first-year students. And the report indicates, it says, first-year students may experience higher risk because they are not as familiar with situations that may lead to sexual assault. So I'm going to go back to the question, are we looking at alcohol objectively? Because while we can potentially agree with this statement and the concerns, we have to continue to do risk reduction training for everyone on campus. But if we're looking at this objectively, let's just change the lens a little bit from this statement. The statement is that they're at higher risk because they are not as familiar with situations that may lead to sexual assault. Wouldn't we be more objective if we thought this way, that offenders often target persons they believe are most vulnerable? That includes people who are under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and that includes people who are perhaps new to campus and naive. And so, again, just changing the lens and asking ourselves, are we looking at alcohol and drug use objectively? Because what we know about studies that have been done on criminal sexual offenders who, again, target individuals, is that they often target someone who they believe is most vulnerable. And so they will leverage power and control to try to, again, take advantage of someone. And so are we looking at this objectively, and are we really thinking about how oftentimes what the research and experience tells us about offender behaviors? The second thing is that in that same line, are we looking at alcohol as a weapon? Oftentimes what we hear when we hear that alcohol is involved in a sexual assault case, we oftentimes hear a lot of victim-blaming statements. Well, why was the victim drinking? Why did the victim have that much to drink? Well, if the victim hadn't had that much to drink, none of this would have happened. So we hear a lot of these kinds of behaviors. This is a shirt that was advertised on Amazon a couple of years ago, and you can see here it's a funny shirt. I circled funny shirt because it's supposed to be funny, but rape really isn't funny. And so if you read this shirt, 2 beers $7, 3 margaritas $15, 4 Jello shots $20, taking home the girl that drank all of the above priceless. That's sexual assault. That's rape. Again, it's using alcohol as a weapon. And are we looking at alcohol objectively, as opposed to saying, why was the victim drinking? Let's ask, is this a thought process that's part of this this equation? Are we looking at alcohol objectively? The second piece of this is, as I said, looking at alcohol as a weapon, but also alcohol as a shield. Oftentimes, offenders have used alcohol as a shield to blame the victim behavior, point the finger at the victim, look what happened because this victim was drinking, but also to excuse their own behavior. And again, if we're investigating an incident where a drunk driver runs over somebody who's been drinking in a crosswalk, we don't excuse that behavior. So why would we want to excuse behavior from someone who has sexually assaulted someone? So again, looking at alcohol a little bit differently, changing the lens just a little bit, looking at alcohol and considering it. Is this one of those situations where someone used alcohol as a weapon and a shield? The next courageous conversation that really kind of goes along with alcohol is are we examining male-dominated cultures? This is, again, a very complex topic because oftentimes men get very defensive about this. And I'm not here to bash my gender during this or any training that I do, but I am here to say we have to have courageous conversations about what this means. Are we examining male-dominated cultures, and are we looking at male-dominated cultures objectively? Now, not every male-dominated culture is going to promote rape or is going to be involved in violence against women, violence on campus, but some are. And so it requires us to look carefully at male-dominated cultures. And part of that, again, goes to, let's recognize this, that oftentimes men walk away from conversations like this feeling, well, all men are to blame. But what we know, what's clear in my own experience, what's clear in the research that's been done, 95% of men do not sexually assault. But if they're not involved in sexual assault or dating violence, what role are they playing? What role are they playing in awareness and prevention? And when I started in this work in the 80s, I was oftentimes the only man in the room. And I'm so happy to see that that's changed, that men and women are standing side by side on this issue, and that has a lot of power. When men and women stand together and talk about these issues, it has a lot of power. So making boys and men part of the solution has to be part of the courageous conversations. Not normalizing and promoting rape. That's not part of the solution that we're talking about here. And in this example, what you see in this internet meme is it's titled Date Rape. This is what fathers pay thousands of dollars to send their daughters off to college for. Let the fun begin. And so essentially what you see is a woman in the top photograph apparently drinking out of a beer funnel, which we can all perhaps agree is risky behavior. That being said, the second photograph shows her apparently unconscious with two young men with their thumbs up with big smiles on their face, assumingly saying, let the fun begin. And again, rape is not funny, but we see and we hear messages like this sometimes that come from male-dominated cultures that is really confusing and has to be addressed. And again, the risk factor isn't the fact that someone is, the significant risk factor isn't the fact that the woman is drinking out of a beer funnel. The significant risk factor is that someone would take advantage of someone who's incapacitated or unconscious. That's how rape happens. So making sure that we are engaging men and not normalizing and promoting rape, that's not part of the solution. Here's just one more quick example, and this is an example that played out on the CBS Atlanta news station a couple of years ago. And essentially what happened in this particular case, I'm not going to show you the news clip, but I've provided the link for it if you'd like to see it. In this particular news clip, it was determined that a fraternity leader sent a email, a written document to other fraternity members, and he signed off on it as in luring rape bait. And essentially the letter talked about how to get women drunk and potentially to take advantage of them. And he signed it in luring rape bait. And so it got a lot of local attention and national attention. And one of the interesting things about this is that 3 students were interviewed as part of this particular news story. The first was a female student, and when she was asked what she thought about this, the female student appears very nervous and anxious, but says basically, I don't feel safe. And as a result of not feeling safe, I'm going to make sure I don't go to fraternities anymore. So what we hear and see oftentimes when we look at sexual assault prevention is that we have directed our efforts so much at women, and the message to this young woman is that she's responsible for her safety, as opposed to, why is someone encouraging rape? The second thing that's perhaps a little bit more disturbing, and this is really troubling when we talk about this. 2 young men are interviewed about the fact that this man put out this message to all of his fraternity members. And both young men say something very similar, which is essentially, well, you know, he probably shouldn't have put this in writing. I don't think he meant for it to get out on the web. He just should have never put this in writing. So if we stop and think about that statement, this is really disturbing, because from my perspective, as someone who's worked with sex offenders, investigated these cases for a long time, ladies and gentlemen, that is a thought process that all of us have to be concerned about. So when we talk about bystander intervention, it's one thing to say, let's make sure we have courageous bystanders that can step in when they see something about to happen. The next phase of this, the next courageous conversation that we have to have about this, is we have to address this thought process as well. If we're not addressing this thought process as part of our courageous conversations, I think we're going to continue to struggle on this issue, because this is a thought process. And that thought process is something that I heard in my lifetime as a young man and as a man growing up. And so that thought process is certainly dangerous, and basically what it says is it's okay to think this way, we just can't let everybody know we think this way. And that has to be addressed as part of our bystander intervention if we're going to make progress on this issue. Steve, this is another perhaps good time to take a short break to see if there are any questions that I can answer before I finish up with the final courageous conversation.
Absolutely, Tom. Thanks. And the questions are coming in, and be sure to keep typing them in. Tom, do you have examples of models of educational materials to combat these kinds of messages that have been well received on campuses or in other venues?
Well, I think there's a lot of great things happening around bystander intervention, and there are several great training models out there. One of the things that I'm trying to encourage in this conversation, Steve, is that it's great to think about if you see 2 people who are intoxicated and potentially, there might be trouble there. That's one level of bystander intervention. What we have to start with is this thought process. So to me, it starts with making sure that on our campuses and in our communities, we have leadership, whether it be faculty, staff, police officers, athletic directors, mentors, who again can mentor young people into recognizing how important it is to address that dangerous thought process. The second thing is that from that, hopefully what we're doing is we're encouraging and we're promoting young men to take more of a leadership role in changing this message, because it's one thing for me to say this and potentially lecture young people. It's another thing for their peers to come out and speak about this. And I think those 2 issues are key, again, to making progress on this issue.
I've been hearing more and more about external review of sexual assault cases. How can universities seek subject matter experts or community partners to review cases when we have to ensure confidentiality?
Certainly confidentiality plays a role in this. I myself have done case reviews for a number of institutions around the country. There There are several other subject matter experts around the country that can do this work. And I think it starts with making sure I've signed confidentiality agreements, removing names from reports so that we can just recognize and understand and look at the approach to these cases and offer the institution or offer the police department with an outside look at how well they did. Give them feedback about where they might want to make changes, where they were in line with policy or best practices. And so confidentiality agreements can be signed as part of that process. As Anne Frank mentioned earlier, having general counsel involved in that, and really just an opportunity for a subject matter expert to sit down with investigators and walk through several of their cases and have open dialogue about what they did really well and what they could do differently. The second part of the external review teams is, again, getting training for perhaps advocates in your community, other multidisciplinary team members in your community. Train them to review all of the cases. This is something that's happening in Missoula. By the way, the Philadelphia Police Department's been doing this since, I believe, 1999. A group of advocates with specialized training review every sexual assault case to make sure that the officers, that the investigators have been trauma-informed and victim-centered, and that they followed their policies and procedures and provide feedback on how to improve our response and investigation. I think this is the future to building public trust and, again, promoting higher rates of reporting, which is going to be critical for us to hold offenders accountable.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question during this break. Do you have any examples of universities providing self-care to those affected by sexual assault?
You know, I think this is one of the areas that unfortunately we don't have a lot of great examples. I think that colleges and universities have been working so hard to improve their response that, again, we've rolled up our sleeves. The progress that's been made in higher ed, from my opinion, the last 5 years has been phenomenal. Great work by great people. We have more work to do. As a result of us working so hard, we haven't recognized this. The criminal justice system recognized this. You can't do this work every day for a long, long, long time. It has its impacts on individuals. It has its impact on the institution. So making sure that you're thinking about self-care, institutional support, and a long-term strategy. That someone can't do this work for 20 years and retire, but that you have a succession plan, that you have investigators that are rotating in and out and supporting one another in the process, I think has to be a big part of self-care and institutional support.
Thanks, Tom. Back to your presentation.
So the final courageous conversation, and again, I hope to leave plenty of time at the end to answer questions. As I said, it's one thing to have bystander intervention. It's another thing, as part of a courageous conversation, to address this thought process that I just talked about. This thought process that it's okay in male-dominated cultures for some men to think this way. Again, not all men are involved in violence. Not all men sexually assault or commit dating violence. But examining the male-dominated culture has to be part of this courageous conversation, including that thought process. And to me, part of that means changing the message. So these are harmful messages that we saw on the T-shirt or the internet meme, and some of the advertising example that I showed you. These are all really harmful messages. So how do we change that message? And I think it really starts with thinking about the impact of language. Because there's so many mixed messages around sexual assault, so many myths and misconceptions, it's important for all of us that do this work, again, to speak accurately about this. This is an interesting example. I did some work up in Winona State University, and I had the opportunity to meet with some of the student-led awareness campaigns, and this is one of them. Again, just thinking about how we use language and how this example of using language can really minimize rape and sexual assault. And so thinking about our language and asking ourselves, are we speaking accurately about sexual assault? There's so many inaccurate messages. There's so many mixed messages and confusing messages that it's important for all of us that work in this field to speak accurately about this. Again, I could spend an entire webinar on this issue alone, but I've kind of hand-selected just a few of the things that I have been addressing nationally in my training. And part of changing the message is really thinking about terms that we might be using that are inaccurate, and then thinking about how do we use terms that are perhaps more accurate. And one of the big ones that I see is the use of the term alleged victim and alleged sexual assault. So one of the things I hear all the time is making sure that investigations are fair and balanced, and that by using the term alleged helps us balance this somehow. And I just think it's an inaccurate term. The term that we ought to be using when someone reports something happening is victim, or in accordance with the guidance that we've received in higher education around Title IX investigations, is to use the term complainant. Alleged in the use of the term alleged victim and alleged sexual assault, in my opinion, is inaccurate, because who is alleged in the criminal justice system? Who is alleged in the student code of conduct system? It's not the victim that's alleged. It's the suspect or the respondent that's alleged to have committed a violation. And so by using the term alleged victim, alleged sexual assault, it's just redundant, because the actually who's alleged in this is the suspect or the respondent. So instead of using alleged sexual assault, it's a reported sexual assault. The term alleged is sometimes so overused around sexual assault and sexual misconduct that oftentimes when you look at other crimes, when you look at other student code of conduct violations, you rarely see the term alleged used in other criminal law violations or student code of conduct violations. But it's oftentimes overused when we're talking about sexual assault and sexual misconduct. So changing the message just asks ourselves, is this accurate, or is this just part of what we've been hearing for so long that it doesn't matter anymore? In my opinion, it does matter. We want to be accurate. So changing alleged victim to victim or complainant, changing alleged sexual assault to reported sexual assault. And again, it speaks more accurately of what we're talking about. The next inaccurate term that I oftentimes hear is the term accuser. And this is a reference to the victim or the complainant. We see this term used a lot in the media. When you trace this term back, one of the things that you can begin to see is that this term was actually used in the criminal justice system by defense attorneys trying to get the jury to kind of look at this case differently. And by using the term accuser, it points the finger at the victim that the reason that we're here is because of what they're reporting. And it's just, from my perspective, another way to blame the victim in these cases. Again, we see victims of sexual assault and sexual misconduct blamed for the incidents more than any other crime or any other issue. So using the term accuser, again, is an inaccurate term. It is victim or complainant. When you ask yourself, who is the accuser in a criminal justice matter, or who is the accuser in a student code of conduct violation, the accurate answer is the state is the accuser in the criminal justice system, and the university is the accuser, because the university is reporting that they believe there are facts and circumstances that the respondent has violated the code of conduct. So as a result, the university is the accuser. And so really looking at this and thinking about how we can use these terms in a more accurate way. Now, I do understand that the term accuser is used in the Clery Act, and I have discussed this with leaders in the Clery Center. And again, I think it's time for a language change so that we speak more accurately about these crimes. One of the other ways that we can change the message, and here's another great example from the Student-Led Awareness poster campaign at Winona State University. Most of our prevention efforts, for a long, long time, I started to work on these issues back in the 80s, and most of our prevention efforts historically have addressed risk reduction. And while risk reduction is important for victims, we have not addressed offender behaviors. And I thought this was a very interesting example that really, again, changes the lens and causes us to have a courageous conversation. And again, are we addressing offender behaviors as part of that courageous conversation? And I think this poster does that, and I think it's a great example of a courageous conversation around this. Another, again, example of this is in changing the message is really getting men involved. Boys and men as part of the solution to this problem has got to be part of this courageous conversation. And this is hard. This is a hard conversation to have on campus. I've had it on campus. I've had it in the military. I've had it in law enforcement. This is a really hard conversation to have. But again, this example shows, again, young men talking about who they want to be and what they stand for. And so this drastically changes the young man who perhaps would wear a T-shirt which talks about alcohol and rape, or promoting alcohol and rape by claiming or suggesting that it's funny. That these young men are talking about that they want to be the kind of person who takes a stand on their campus, in their community, with their friends, to prevent sexual assault, and really asking young men to engage in this process. And I think one of the most important parts of this conversation is that if, given the level of activism and outrage, the level of communication and concern in our country around sexual assault and sexual misconduct today, that if we're not talking about this, what does that mean? That if we're not having a conversation, if we don't take a stand on this issue, then if we remain silent on this issue, given all of the activism that is around sexual assault today, what does that mean? Does that mean it's that we approve this? And I don't think most men don't approve of this. So again, really getting young men to change the message and think about where they stand on this issue. And again, when men and women stand together on a campus or in a community, in a police department, whatever the case may be, that has a lot of power. And again, standing together, not just addressing when we see someone who's incapacitated, perhaps being dragged into a potentially dangerous situation. That's one level of bystander intervention that's important. To me, the most important part of that example, or our prevention efforts, is again addressing that thought process, that dangerous thought process that we heard briefly in this presentation. So again, really changing the message. And then lastly, I think one of the most important things is really thinking about leadership on this issue. This issue needs leaders. This issue needs leaders, and we've seen it. I showed you a couple of examples of university presidents who came out and owned the problem, who came out and said, we need to do a better job. That's great leadership. But anybody can be a leader on this issue. You don't have to be a university president or a police chief. You don't have to be a politician or an elected official. Anyone can be a leader on this issue. I think back oftentimes to when I started my career many years ago in charge of a sexual assault investigation unit. I was a young man at 26, and I never thought that I would be a leader on these issues. But by engaging in these conversations regularly, by working on these issues, by working in a multidisciplinary team and learning from each other, I learned a lot from victims and survivors. I learned a lot from offenders. I learned a lot from advocates and prosecutors and higher education. And that learning combined has helped provide and will continue to help provide others with the information they need to be effective leaders on these issues. This issue needs leaders, and all of us, regardless of our role, regardless of our rank, our position in the institution, we all can be a leader on this issue. And so this webinar is during Sexual Assault Awareness Month is really as much a call to leadership as it is anything else. A call to leadership to have courageous conversations, to be able to engage in this without getting upset, without getting defensive, and really with the eye on how do we raise the bar? How do we raise our personal bar to be a better leader on this issue? How do we raise the institutional bar or the department bar so that we can be better prepared to respond and investigate these cases in a more effective way. That ends the presentation. I would certainly be happy to answer any questions. I tried to leave enough time to answer questions. Steve, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
And we do have some out there, and you can keep them coming. Tom, courageous conversations may require relationship. How do you establish a bystander culture in a transient, non-residential environment like a community college?
Wow, that's a great question. I think this is one of those areas that, again, we're trying to recognize. Colleges and universities have been moving so quickly to get better that in a lot of respects, the community colleges that are working as hard are struggling with some very different challenges. And I think that this participant has listed a very significant challenge. The courageous conversation that needs to occur in a community college when you have such a transient population is a complex one. But I think what I will say is that, as I've said many times before, whatever we do, whatever we decide to do, is that this can't be a one-time conversation. We aren't going to resolve these issues until we have a continued conversation, because these are so complex. So the hope is that what we're doing today on college campuses, in our military, we're having more and more conversations around this, that this will become the norm, that it will become the norm in middle schools and high schools to, again, recognize and understand healthy relationships, understand what consent is and what consent isn't, and hopefully, over time, by all of us promoting this conversation, it becomes part of our community as a whole, and that includes our community colleges, where, again, folks are coming from workplace, folks are coming from high schools and other colleges, and so just trying to promote the conversation wherever we are is again part of that leadership opportunity that we all have.
Have you worked with universities to help review protocols and policies around reported sexual assault on study abroad programs? If so, what are some of the best practices in this area, given some of the unique challenges in such situations, distance, different resources, etc.?
There are a lot of complex issues in this, and I've worked limitedly with a couple of institutions that have programs. Of course, what we all know is that the institution's going to be responsible for investigating, for ensuring that there is no retaliation, for putting an end to it, regardless of where it occurs. And so, I've heard things from around the country with institutions that have those responsibilities, contracting with folks who are either in their country where the program is occurring to conduct investigations, training them, preparing them. I've certainly seen situations where investigations have been done remotely, which is not ideal. But these are some of the unique challenges that institutions are facing, and I think this is one of those areas that, as this conversation continues to evolve, that we look at more closely and look for best practices in this. Perhaps this is one of those areas that the National Center could focus on and really get a list of some of the best practices that institutions are doing for programs that they have overseas.
What are your feelings around institutions conducting internal investigations into reported assaults that are independent of the criminal justice system?
So I assume you're talking about when a victim or complainant chooses not to report to the criminal justice system. And again, we have to. I'm big on victim-centered and trauma-informed approaches. There are times that victims who have been assaulted, sexually assaulted, dating violence, and they've experienced trauma. And sometimes that trauma is so overwhelming that they can't engage in our overwhelming systems. So I'm a big supporter, and if any of you have heard me train, you've heard me talk a lot about trauma-informed approaches, and victim empowerment. And that means empowering victims to make their own choices about whether or not they want to report to the police. That being said, I think there's a lot we can do to encourage this. We can empower victims, and we can offer encouraging statements when, again, the Title IX investigation and the criminal justice system work together. That has a lot of power, and you know, again, justice is measured in a lot of different ways. But both systems can work together. But to me, it really, the bottom line is that we have to empower victims to make their own choices. That's going to be most helpful to them.
Sorry? Conversations seem to only thrive in the texting media. Face-to-face seems very challenging for the current generation. I guess my question is, do you know of any best practices for teaching the communication skills in social settings where rape is most likely to occur?
That's a great point. I oftentimes think, I have 2 college-age daughters, and I still like to talk on the telephone. And I remember calling my daughter once, and she said, "Hey, Dad, it's nice to have you on the phone, but can you just text me your question, and I'll get back to you?" And I said, "But we're on the phone." So I get this point. I think some of the efforts, again, that we're making, online training, and some of the other things that we're doing using technology, while we're having these conversations, the polling technology and whatnot, while we're having conversations, I think has been really interesting. I had the opportunity to observe conversations on college campuses where they're engaging in these really courageous conversations and then using technology and texting technology to poll the audience on their thoughts and feelings. And I saw more interaction and less defensiveness in that kind of a conversation. And I thought that had a lot of promise. But again, I'm going to go back to the challenge that we cannot just have an online course or a one-time conversation, but everyone on our campus has to see and hear the concerns around this on a regular basis if we're going to make progress.
One final question. You've been to our campus before, and it was helpful to hear some of the trends you're seeing nationally around sexual misconduct that we should be looking for. Can you share some additional thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I do a lot of investigation training for, again, both police and Title IX investigators. I would say there's a couple of trends that I've shared in my training nationally, and I'll share here today. And one of them is around incapacitated rape, when the victim is incapacitated. And the number of investigators that I have talked to, both Title IX and criminal investigators, who have shared with me case examples of incapacitated rape where the suspect and or suspects have photographed and videotaped parts of the conduct. Again, investigators asking questions and investigating this. A lot of times we look at these kind of cases when alcohol's involved we look at this and say, oh my God, this is really complicated. There's no way we're going to be able to resolve this case. The victim can't even remember. The number of cases that I have seen over the past several months where investigators have found evidence of photographs and video of incapacitated rape are just astonishing to me. And so making sure our investigators are looking at their digital forensics capabilities. Do you have capabilities to examine phones and computers and text messages and not? And I think that has to be part of this.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks to all of our viewers and questioners from around the Internet. Check the NCCPS webinars page for a link to the captioned recording of today's webinar, as well as a link to our speaker slides. The brief evaluation survey on today's session that I mentioned earlier should already be in your mailbox. It will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete it. Please do. We read and act on your comments. The next webinar from Campus Public Safety Online will take place on Tuesday, May 17th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Our speaker will be Anne Franke, and her topic is Planning for the Safety of Minors, Routine and Emergency Situations. Look around campus and you'll notice lots of kids, minors. Most institutions develop safety and emergency protocols to meet the needs of college students and adult visitors. How do kids fit in? From cataloging campus youth programs to dealing with a lost child at graduation or a missing kid at camp, to whether a campus public safety officer should interview a 5-year-old about suspected child abuse or neglect, this webinar will cover vital issues to raise at your institution and practical options for resolving them. Our speaker, Anne Franke, is a recognized expert in the protection of children on college and university campuses, working with institutions nationwide to safeguard the minors with whom they interact. The webinar is free, but registration is required. Click the link on your screen or visit the NCCPS webinars page, and save the date for the first annual NCCPS Trauma-Informed Sexual Assault Investigation and Adjudication Program event, hosted at the George Washington University, July 18th to 22nd, featuring speakers from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, Clery Act Compliance Division, Office for Victims of Crimes, the Center for Disease Control, the Victims' Rights Law Center, and the Clery Center for Security on Campus. Subscribe to our mailing list to be the first to get registration information. Campus Public Safety Online is brought to you by the National Center for Campus Public Safety, with support from the University of Vermont Continuing and Distance Education and the U.S. Department of Justice. Special thanks today to Adam Ruth. This is Steve Worona. See you next time on Campus Public Safety Online.